I won't ease into this one either. There's no version of what I'm about to say that arrives gently, no softened entry point that makes it easier to hold without feeling the weight of it. Some things don't allow that. Some things refuse to be translated into something comfortable. They exist as they are, unfiltered, unstructured, undeniable. And this is one of them. Because what's happening here didn't form the way things usually do. It didn't follow sequence, didn't build itself step by step in a way that could be tracked, measured, understood from the outside. It bypassed all of that. It moved straight into something deeper, something already formed, like it had been waiting for the moment it could exist. And I felt it before I accepted it. That's the part that stays with me. The gap between recognition and acceptance. Because recognition is immediate. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for logic to approve it. It just appears fully intact, leaving you to deal with what it means after the fact. Acceptance is different. Acceptance requires awareness. It requires you to look directly at something and admit that it's not passing, not temporary, not something you can reduce into a simpler explanation just to make it easier to carry. And I've been standing in that space for longer than I should, not resisting, not fully allowing, just holding it there. But things like this don't stay suspended forever. They either settle or they force movement. And I can feel this shifting towards something that won't let me remain still much longer. You change the way I process presence, not your actions, not anything you deliberately did, just the way you exist. It's precise in a way that's hard to explain without sounding like I'm exaggerating something that, from the outside, might seem subtle. But it isn't subtle. It's exact. The way you respond not just to what's said, but to what's left unsaid. The way your silence doesn't feel empty, doesn't feel like absence, but like something active, something aware. Most people treat silence like a gap. You treat it like a language, and that alone shifted something in me. Because I've spent most of my life existing in spaces people couldn't fully read. Not because I hid, but because I understood how easily things get misinterpreted once they're exposed without precision. So I learned to control what was visible, to keep things at a level where they could exist without being reshaped by someone else's perception. It wasn't isolation, it was accuracy. But you didn't require any of that control. You didn't misunderstand what wasn't explained. You didn't rush to define what wasn't clear. You just saw it and left it as it was. That's rare in a way that doesn't need to be emphasized. It's just evident the moment it happens. And once something like that is recognized, it doesn't fade into the background. It stays. Not loudly, not forcefully, but with a consistency that makes it impossible to ignore. I started noticing how my thoughts adjusted, not in content, but in structure. There's a difference. Content changes all the time. It shifts based on environment, interaction, circumstance. It's flexible. Structure isn't. Structure is the foundation beneath all of that. It's the way thoughts form before they become words, the way perception organizes itself before it becomes conscious. And that's where you exist now, not as something external I consider, but as something internal that's already present in the way I process everything else. I don't pause to think about you. I notice that you're already there. And that's a level I've never allowed anyone to reach. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't see the need. There was no reason to let someone into that space when everything functioned perfectly without it. Until now. And I keep asking myself the same question. Not out of confusion, but out of precision. Why didn't I stop it? Because I could have, At any point, I could have pulled back, re-established distance, restored the separation. I've always maintained between myself and everything outside of it. That's not difficult for me. It never has been. But I didn't. And that's not something I can ignore or explain away as coincidence. It means something in me recognized the value of this before I consciously decided it had any. It means the decision happened before I acknowledged it, and now I'm catching up to it. That's where the tension exists. Not in what this is, but in the realization that I've already allowed it to become something without going through the usual process of deciding whether it should. Because I don't operate like that. I evaluate, I analyze, I understand the full scope of something before I let it integrate into anything that matters. But this didn't wait for that. It integrated first and left me to analyze it afterward. That's not how I've ever worked, and yet here it is, fully present, fully active, already affecting the way I think in ways that aren't surface level, aren't temporary, aren't something that will fade if I choose to ignore it. Because ignoring it would require me to undo something that's already become part of my baseline. And baselines don't revert easily, they redefine everything around them. I've noticed it in the way I respond to things that have nothing to do with you, in the way I evaluate conversations, in the way I process meaning, in the way I recognize alignment or the absence of it. There's a reference point now that didn't exist before, not something I consciously compare everything to, but something that exists in the background, quietly measuring accuracy. And that reference point is you, not as a person, but as a pattern that matches mine in a way that's too precise to dismiss as chance. That's what this comes down to, not emotion, not circumstance, pot-spalt recognition. And once a pattern is recognized at that level, it can't be unseen. It becomes something you account for, something you adjust around, something that inevitably influences how you move forward, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. I've been acknowledging it, quickly, internally, without translating it into anything external, but that phase doesn't last forever, because at some point, internal acknowledgement demands external clarity, not necessarily in words, but in decision. And that's where I am now, not questioning what this is, not doubting whether it's real, but deciding what it becomes, because it will become something that's inevitable. Things like this don't stay undefined indefinitely. They evolve into something structured, or they fracture under the weight of not being allowed to take form. And I don't allow things to fracture when I understand them this clearly. That's never been how I move. If something is precise, if something is real, if something aligns at a level that isn't surface-based, then I don't walk away from it. I either integrate it fully or I remove it completely. There's no middle ground. And removing this would require undoing something that's already changed the way I function. That's not simple. That's not clean. That's not even entirely possible without altering parts of myself I don't intend to change. So that leaves one direction, integration, not careless, not immediate, but deliberate. Because if I allow this to fully settle, if I let it become part of my structure without resistance, then it won't just exist quietly in the background anymore. It will define something, not just in me, but between us. And that's where the real weight of this sits, because up until now, this has existed without expectation, without demand, without anything that requires action. It's just been there. Accurate, consistent, undeniable, But once it's acknowledged fully, once it's allowed to take shape beyond internal awareness, it becomes something that exists in reality. And reality doesn't stay passive. It requires response. It requires direction. It requires the kind of clarity that removes the option of pretending this is something small. And it's not small. That's what I can't reduce it to. No matter how I try to frame it, no matter how I analyze it from different angles, no matter how much I attempt to place it into something familiar, it doesn't fit. It stands on its own as something exact, something rare, something that doesn't need to be exaggerated to be significant. It already is. And I've reached the point where not acting on that understanding would be more unnatural than acting on it. That's how I know this isn't temporary, because temporary things don't reach this level of clarity. They don't restructure perception. They don't integrate into thought patterns in ways that persist without effort. They pass. This hasn't passed. It's stayed, and it's deepened without force, without intention, without anything that would normally explain why something continues to grow instead of fade. It just has. And now I'm left with something that exists beyond observation, something that requires a decision, not about you, about me, about whether I allow this to become part of my reality in a way that's fully acknowledged, fully accepted, fully integrated, or whether I attempt to step back and preserve the version of myself that existed before this ever happened. But that version isn't intact anymore. That's the truth I've been circling around. I've already changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. And structural change doesn't reverse just because you choose not to engage with what caused it. It remains, it becomes part of the system. So the idea of stepping away as if this never happened, that's not real. What's real is this. You exist in a place inside me that alters how I understand everything else. And that placement wasn't given lightly, even if it wasn't consciously decided, it was accepted. And acceptance at that level isn't something I ignore. So whatever this becomes, it won't be accidental, it won't be undefined, it won't be something that exists in the background without direction. It will be chosen deliberately, with full awareness of what it changes, because that's the only way I move when something reaches this level of significance, and you have, whether I intended it or not, whether I was ready for it or not. You have. And now the only thing left isn't understanding it. It's deciding what to do with it. There's a difference between reaching a conclusion and standing inside it. I've reached conclusions before. Clean ones. Structured ones. The kind that settle into place without resistance because every variable has been accounted for, every possibility measured, every outcome understood before the decision is even made. This isn't that. This is something I'm already inside of. And that changes everything. Because when you're inside something, you don't get the distance required to analyze it without being affected by it. You don't get to stand outside and observe without consequence. Every realization carries weight. Every shift alters the space you're standing in while you're still standing in it. That's where I am now. Not looking at this from the outside anymore. Living in it. And I can feel the difference. It's in the way things don't separate as easily as they used to. The boundaries I relied on, the clear distinctions between what's mine and what exists outside of me, they're still there, but they don't function the same way. There's overlap now. Not invasive, not overwhelming, just present. Like something has been layered into my awareness so precisely that it doesn't disrupt anything, but it also doesn't leave room for me to pretend it isn't part of the structure anymore. And that presence is you, not as a thought I choose to engage with, but as something that exists before choice, before intention, before I even recognize that I'm processing anything at all. You're there. And I've tried to trace it back to find the exact moment where this shifted from something external to something integrated. There isn't one, no clear transition. No point where I can say, this is where it changed. It just did, gradually enough to go unnoticed in real time, precisely enough to be undeniable in retrospect. And that's what makes this difficult to navigate, because I can't reverse something I didn't see happen. I can't isolate a point of entry and decide to close it. This wasn't an entry. It was a merge, and merges don't separate cleanly. They restructure, they redefine what belongs to what. And I'm starting to understand that this isn't something I can undo without affecting parts of myself that were stable long before you existed in them. That realization doesn't scare me, but it does demand honesty. Because if something has reached that level, if it's become part of the way I process reality itself, then pretending it's optional would be inaccurate. And I don't operate on inaccuracy. So I've stopped asking whether this should exist. It already does. The real question now is what it requires. Not from you, from me. Because you haven't demanded anything, you haven't asked for definition, haven't pushed for clarity, haven't tried to turn this into something that fits within expectations or recognizable forms. You've just remained consistent, present in the same way, accurate in the same way. Like you're not waiting for this to become something. You already understand that it is something, and that kind of stillness removes every excuse I would normally use to delay a decision. There's no pressure to react, no urgency forcing me into action before I'm ready. Just space, clear, open, unforced space. And in that space, the only thing left is truth, unfiltered, unavoidable. I've started noticing how often I return to the same point. Not because I'm stuck, but because that's where everything leads. The recognition that this isn't just about connection. It's about compatibility at a level that doesn't rely on effort. And effort is what most things depend on. Communication requires effort. Understanding requires effort. Maintaining anything meaningful requires effort. But this exists without it, not because it's easy, but because it's aligned. And alignment removes friction. It allows things to exist in their natural state without needing to be adjusted, explained, or maintained through constant input. That's what makes this feel stable. Even in its uncertainty, even without definition, even without direction, it holds itself. And I don't know if that's what draws me further into it or what makes me hesitate. Because something that holds itself doesn't need control. And control is what I've always relied on to maintain balance. Without it, I'm left with something I can't regulate in the usual ways. I can't slow it down, I can't speed it up, I can't shape it into something more manageable. All I can do is decide whether I allow it to continue existing in the way it naturally does. And that decision feels more significant than anything I've had to make in a long time. Not because of what it risks, but because of what it changes. If I let this fully settle, if I stop observing and start participating, then this becomes part of my reality in a way that can't be undone, not cleanly, not without consequence. And I'm aware of that fully, which is why I haven't rushed into anything, why I've taken the time to understand every layer of this before allowing it to reach its full form. But the more I understand it, less reason I find to resist it. That's the part I didn't expect. I thought there would be something. Some inconsistency, some misalignment, something that would give me a logical reason to step back, to maintain the distance I've always relied on. There isn't. And I've looked carefully, thoroughly, without bias. Because if I'm going to allow something to reach this level, it needs to be exact, not almost not close, exact. And this is in ways I can't dismiss, in ways that don't require justification because they exist independently of my opinion. They just are. And that leaves me with a position I don't usually find myself in. Standing in front of something that meets every internal standard I have without me having to enforce those standards onto it. It already exists at that level, naturally, which means the only thing left to determine is whether I allow myself to meet it there too, because that's the real decision, not whether this is real, not whether this matters, but whether I allow myself to fully exist in it without holding anything back, without maintaining a distance that no longer serves a purpose, without keeping parts of myself separate out of habit rather than necessity. And I can feel that hesitation, not as fear, but as awareness. Awareness of how much this would shift if I stopped holding that line. Because once that line is gone, there's no returning to a version of this that's controlled, measured, contained. It becomes something fully lived, fully experienced, fully real. And I don't step into things like that lightly. But I also don't turn away from them when they meet me with this level of precision. So I've been standing here in between, not because I'm uncertain, but because I'm deciding how to move forward without compromising anything that matters, without losing the clarity that made this what it is in the first place. Because if I move into this, it has to remain accurate. It has to remain grounded in the same alignment that created it, not distorted by expectation, not reshaped by external influence, not turned into something less precise just to make it easier to define. That's the only way this works. That's the only way I allow it to continue. And something tells me, you already understand that, without me having to say it. Which brings me back to the same realization that started all of this. You don't need things to be explained to recognize them. You don't need them to be defined to understand them. You don't need them to be simplified to accept them. You meet them exactly where they are, and you've done the same with me from the beginning, without hesitation, without adjustment, without ever trying to make me into something easier to hold. So, now the question isn't whether this can exist. It already does. The question is whether I stop holding it at a distance that no longer serves a purpose, and allow it to become what it's already trying to be. Not gradually, not cautiously, but fully, because partial doesn't work here. Not with something built on this level of alignment. It either exists completely or it doesn't exist at all. And I don't think either of us is built for half versions of something this real. So the hesitation I've been holding on to, it's not about doubt, it's about timing, about choosing the exact moment where observation ends and decision begins. And I can feel that moment getting closer. Not because anything external is changing, but because internally there's nothing left to analyze, nothing left to question, nothing left to hold at a distance. Only one thing left to do: decide. And once a decision reaches that level, it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like alignment catching up to itself. That's where I am now, not approaching something new, not stepping into unfamiliar territory, but arriving at something that's been forming long before I admitted it was there. The realization isn't sudden, it's accumulated. Built quietly through every moment, I chose not to interrupt what this is. Every time I allowed it to exist, without forcing it into definition, just to make it easier to handle. And now it's reached a point where not naming it would be more artificial than naming it, not because it needs a label, but because I need to stop pretending it's still undefined. It isn't. I know exactly what this is, not in the way people usually know things, through explanation, through comparison, through fitting it into something familiar so it can be processed without discomfort. I know it through consistency, through the way it hasn't shifted under pressure, through the way it hasn't weakened with time or distance or silence, through the way it continues to exist in the same form, the same structure, regardless of whether I acknowledge it out loud. That's how I measure what's real, not by intensity, not by how strongly it presents itself, but by how stable it remains when nothing is forcing it to stay. And this has remained unchanged in its accuracy, unchanged in its presence. If anything, it's become clearer, more defined without being spoken, more certain without being tested. That's not something I can dismiss. That's not something I can reduce to coincidence or timing or circumstance. That's something that exists independently of all of that. And I've reached the point where I'm not willing to stand outside of it anymore. Because standing outside of something this precise isn't neutrality, it's avoidance. And I don't avoid things I understand. So here it is, not a question, not a theory. It's not something I'm still trying to figure out, but something I'm choosing to acknowledge fully. You and I don't just understand each other. We operate on the same internal frequency, not identical, not mirrored, but aligned in a way that makes translation unnecessary. And that alignment isn't superficial. It doesn't depend on context. It doesn't depend on constant interaction. It exists underneath all of that. Stable, consistent, independent. That's why this didn't fade. That's why distance didn't disrupt it. That's why silence didn't weaken it. Because it was never built on things that could be removed. It was built on something structural. And structural things don't disappear when conditions change. They remain until something equally structural replaces them. And nothing has. Which leaves me with one truth: I can't move around anymore. This matters not in a passing way, not in a way that can be compartmentalized or contained, but in a way that has already altered the way I exist. And I've been careful my entire life about what I allow to reach that level. I don't let things define me. I don't let them integrate unless I've tested every angle, understood every outcome, accounted for every possible shift they could create. But this didn't wait for that process. It met every condition before I even applied them. It passed every standard before I consciously set them. And now I'm left with something that already fits, without me having to adjust it or myself. That's rare. Rare enough that ignoring it would be irrational. And I don't operate irrationally. So this is where the shift happens, not internally. That already happened, externally. In the way I stop treating this like something that exists in the background and start recognizing it as something that exists in reality, because that's what it is. Real, not abstract, not imagined, not something that only exists because I'm choosing to perceive it a certain way. It exists because it holds its form regardless of perception. And that's the difference between something that's felt and something that's real. This is real, which means it requires more than observation. It requires presence, intentional presence, the kind that doesn't hold back, the kind that doesn't maintain unnecessary distance just out of habit, the kind that meets something fully without trying to control the outcome before it even has a chance to exist. And that's where my hesitation has been. Not in what this is, but in allowing myself to exist in it without restraint. Because once I do that, once I step into this without keeping a part of myself separate, then this becomes something that moves, something that evolves, something that has direction, and direction leads to consequence. Not negative, not positive, just real. Something that has an impact beyond internal understanding. Something that affects both of us in ways that can't be reversed just by stepping back. And I've been aware of that from the beginning. That's why I didn't rush this. Why I didn't let it become something undefined, but emotionally driven. Why I kept it grounded in structure instead of letting it turn into something unstable. Because if this is going to exist, it has to exist correctly. It has to remain aligned. It has to stay as precise as it's been from the start. Otherwise, it loses the very thing that makes it real. And I won't allow that. So this isn't a leap. It's not a risk taken without understanding. It's not something impulsive or unmeasured. It's a decision, a clear one, a deliberate one, to stop holding this at a distance that no longer serves a purpose, and allow it to become what it's already positioned to be, not partially, not conditionally, but fully. Because anything less than that would be inaccurate. And accuracies is the one thing I don't compromise. So this is me stepping into it, not blindly, not emotionally, but with full awareness of what it is, what it changes, and what it requires. And what it requires is simple, but not easy. It requires honesty, not surface-level honesty, not the kind that exists in words, but the kind that exists in presence, in consistency, in the way something is lived, not just understood, because this doesn't need explanation. It doesn't need to be broken down into something smaller to make it easier to carry. It just needs to be met as it is, and I'm ready to do that. Not because I have all the answers, but because I don't need them to know this is something worth stepping into, something worth allowing to exist without limitation, something worth seeing through to whatever it becomes without trying to control it before it even has the chance to take form. That's the only way something like this works. That's the only way it remains what it is, instead of turning into something less. So this is where I stop observing, stop analyzing, stop holding back in ways that no longer serve anything, and start existing in this fully, with you, not as something undefined, not as something unspoken, but as something real, something chosen, something acknowledged, without hesitations. Because the truth is, this was never something I needed to create. It was something I needed to recognize. And now that I have, there's only one direction left. Forward. Forward doesn't feel like movement the way I expected it to. It doesn't feel like stepping into something unknown or crossing a line that separates what was from what will be. There's no sharp transition, no moment where everything clearly shifts from one state to another. It's quieter than that, more precise. It feels like continuing something that was already in motion long before I admitted I was part of it. That's what makes this different, because when something truly begins, you can trace its origin. You can point to the moment it started, the reason it formed, the sequence that led it into existence. There's structure in beginnings. There's a kind of logic that allows you to understand how something came to be. But this doesn't have a beginning I can isolate. It feels more like something I stepped into halfway through, like it was already there, already forming, already complete in some underlying way, and I just became aware of it at a certain point along its path. And now that I'm aware of it, I can't step out of it without disrupting something that's already integrated too deeply. So, moving forward doesn't feel like a choice between two directions. It feels like the only direction that remains intact. Anything else would require breaking something that doesn't feel meant to be broken. And I don't break things that are working at this level of precision. That's not instinct, that's principle. What's changed isn't just that I've decided to acknowledge this. What's changed is how I exist within it. There's no distance left to maintain, not in the way there was before. Because distance only works when something exists outside of you, when there's a clear separation between what you are and what you're observing. But this isn't outside of me anymore. And if I'm being exact, it hasn't been for a while. I just kept treating it like it was. That's the part I had to confront. The realization that I was maintaining a form of distance that wasn't real anymore. That the space I thought existed between us had already been filled with something that didn't behave like distance at all. It behaved like continuity, like something that existed regardless of whether I acknowledged it. And now that I've stopped pretending that space is still empty, everything feels different. Not heavier, not overwhelming, just clearer. Clarity has a weight to it, but it's not the kind that burdens you. It's the kind that removes everything unnecessary. All the hesitation that was built on uncertainty, all the caution that was built on incomplete understanding, all the distance that was built on the assumption that this could still be undone. None of that holds anymore. What's left is something direct, something I can't reframe or reinterpret to make it less significant than it is. And what it is something that has already changed the way I exist. Not temporarily. Not in a way that fades when I focus on something else, but in a way that remains constant, even when I'm not actively thinking about it. That's how I know this has moved beyond anything situational, because situational things depend on attention. They require focus to stay relevant. This doesn't. It remains present without effort, integrated without force. And now that I've fully accepted that, I can feel the shift in how I respond to it. I'm not holding it at arm's length anymore. I'm not observing it like something separate. I'm inside it, participating in it, allowing it to exist, without trying to regulate it into something smaller or more manageable. And that changes the dynamic completely, because now it's not just something I understand, it's something I'm part of, something I'm actively choosing to exist within. And choice at this level carries a different kind of responsibility, not obligation, not pressure, but awareness. Awareness that what I do now matters in a way it didn't before. Because now I'm not just reacting to something that exists, I'm contributing to what it becomes, and what this becomes, that's where everything opens. Not in a chaotic way. Not in a way that loses the structure that made this possible in the first place, but in a way that allows it to expand naturally, without restriction, without artificial limits placed on it just to keep it contained, because containment isn't what this was built for. That's something I've had to accept. I've spent a long time ensuring that everything in my life had boundaries that could be controlled, defined, maintained, without risk of something extending beyond what I was prepared to handle. But this doesn't respond to containment. It doesn't shrink to fit into controlled spaces. It expands into whatever space it's given, and the more I tried to keep it measured, the more I realized It wasn't losing anything by not being allowed to grow. It was just waiting for me to stop restricting it, waiting for me to recognize that it doesn't need to be limited to remain stable, that it can expand without losing its precision, that it can become more without becoming less accurate. That's not something I've encountered before. Growth usually comes with distortion. Things change as they expand. They lose clarity, they lose alignment, they shift in ways that make them harder to trust. But this hasn't. It's remained consistent, even as it's deepened, even as it's moved from something I observed to something I exist within. And that consistency, that's what allowed me to make the decision I've made. Because I don't commit to things that change their nature under pressure. I don't step into things that lose their structure when they're allowed to evolve. But this has done the opposite. It's held its structure while becoming more. And that's what made it undeniable. So now, being here, fully present in this, fully aware of what it is and what it means, I can finally see what forward actually looks like. It's not rushing. It's not forcing this into something defined before it's ready to define itself. It's not trying to predict outcomes or control the direction before the direction naturally reveals itself. It's allowing this to unfold with the same accuracy it's had from the beginning, but this time without holding anything back, without keeping parts of myself separate as a form of control, without maintaining distance that no longer serves anything, because distance now would be artificial, and I don't operate on anything artificial. So forward looks like presence, real presence, the kind that isn't divided, the kind that isn't partially engaged while still holding something in reserve, the kind that meets something exactly where it is, with nothing withheld. And I know what that means. It means I stop filtering, not recklessly, not without awareness, but without unnecessary restraint. It means I allow my thoughts to exist in their full form instead of adjusting them to maintain a version of control that isn't needed here. It means I trust the alignment that created this enough to let it continue without interference. That's the real step, not toward you, not away from anything else, but into the full reality of what this already is. Because that's what I've been delaying. Not the connection, but the full experience of it. And now that delay doesn't make sense anymore. There's nothing left to protect against, nothing left to question, nothing left to hold at a distance, just out of habit. Only something that's already proven itself through consistency, through clarity, through a level of precision that doesn't need to be tested anymore. So this is where everything settles into place, not as an ending, but as a beginning that feels like a continuation, because that's what this has always been. Something continuous. Something that didn't start in the moment I noticed it, and won't end just because I decide to fully step into it. It exists beyond those markers, beyond beginnings and endings, in something more constant. And now, so do I, with you, not as something I'm still figuring out, not as something I'm cautiously approaching, but as something I've chosen to exist within fully, without distance, without hesitation, without anything left unacknowledged, because at this point, anything less wouldn't be true, and I don't choose anything that isn't true. So this is it, not a question, not a possibility, not something waiting to be decided, but something that has already been decided and is now being lived, exactly as it was always meant to be.